Now, this morning, the government warned that a vote to leave the EU could lead to a decade of uncertainty. The government's first official analysis claims the UK would be unlikely to negotiate its exit within the two-year timetable and that it could take the UK 10 years to extricate itself. It suggests other countries could push for concessions if the UK needs longer to arrange its exit. It says a new agreement on trade might require ratification by other national parliaments. The report claims that this uncertainty would have an impact on financial markets, investment and the value of the pound. It also warns that the rights of 2 million British expats to work and access services in EU countries might not be guaranteed. But Commons leader Chris Grayling, who is campaigning for Britain to leave the EU, said the 10-year claim was ludicrous. He accused the government of running a relentless campaign of fear. Emma Reynolds, do you agree with that assessment? A 10-year period of uncertainty if Britain votes to leave the EU?
The truth is we don't know. Switzerland are still trying to negotiate unfettered access to the single market as being outside the EU. They haven't got that unfettered access and they're having to negotiate all sorts of agreements with different member states. So I think it certainly is in our interests, economically, in terms of jobs and investment, to stay in the EU. And I think it is right, although we lead with the positive arguments, we also need to point out the risks of leaving and what might happen if we did leave. So I think the government is right to do an analysis of what it might mean, and I think there would be a lot of uncertainty. And indeed, the pound last week, dropped to its lowest value for 7 years because of the uncertainty of the referendum and the fears of perhaps the UK leaving. So I think that only serves to underline what might happen if we were to leave.
And Owen Paterson, one of the sections in the government's assessment is uncertainty during the negotiating period, and this could be 2 years after the date of the referendum result if Britain votes to leave, could have an impact on financial markets, investment and the value of the pound, and as a consequence on the wider economy and jobs. Is there anything in that that's not true?
Well, I just think this whole Operation Fear is achieving new hysterical heights. By the time we get to June, we'll have dragons coming out of the Thames and serpents coming out of our taps being predicted.
But is that untrue? Is that statement untrue?
Day one, nothing changes. 24th of June, we are still full members of the EU. Any sensible government would begin a programme of serious discussion with our neighbours as to what the final outcome might be. There would be serious months of negotiation, going through carefully what sort of arrangement we will end up with. And at that point, I would suggest, if you use Article 50, you trigger Article 50, which gives you a legally binding 2-year period. But the point about this is, if our neighbours are as awful as the government's suggesting, that they're going to treat us badly, what on earth are they suggesting we stay in the EU anyway for? The fact is, our neighbours do huge trade with us. There are 5 million Europeans whose jobs depend on sales to the UK, 1 million Germans alone. We send 2.6 million car engines abroad. Most of them come back in finished products. They will want to do a deal. Angela Merkel is not to infuriate 1 million German workers whose jobs depend on sales to
All
the
right,
UK.
well, let's come
So there will be goodwill.
to...
But if I very quickly, if you look... So everything continues, all the current rules continue, we continue as full members, and very importantly, all existing treaties continue. So if you take Czechoslovakia, when there was the Velvet divorce, that all went off very smoothly, and there's no reason at all why this should not happen.
And that is true. We'll come on to the sort of deal that the UK could negotiate, but it is absolutely true that if on June the 24th Britain notifies and triggers Article 50, that from that point until the end of the negotiation, nothing changes. Those treaties stay as they are. The pre-existing treaties and obligations will not cease from that day. That's right, isn't it, Emma? Until a new negotiation is completed.
The best way to keep those conditions is for us to stay in the EU, and I do feel that there is a big inconsistency on the Eurosceptics' part. On the one hand, they say, if we stay in the EU, we will always be losers, even though your own longest-serving Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, forged ahead with the single market, one of the most successful things about the EU, and our own longest-serving Prime Minister, Tony Blair, created the conditions for enlargement and pushed ahead successfully for that. But somehow the Eurosceptics are pessimistic about our role in the EU working together, where we often are the winners. But somehow, if we were to come out, They think they could have everything that they want without having to abide by any of the rules or any of the conditions. Norway abides by all of the rules, and they are a rule taker. They have to abide by the rules of the single market, they have to abide by the free movement of people, and they have to pay into the EU budget in order to get access to that single market.
But that's not to say that Britain couldn't...
They should not pretend that somehow this would be a cost-free option.
But
it would not.
But that's not to say that Britain couldn't negotiate a better deal for Britain if that was the case. But let's have a look at the issue of uncertainty, Owen Paterson, because already, as Emma Reynolds alluded to in her first answer, the financial markets are jittery about Brexit. The pound did slump against the dollar over concerns last week. And it could also lead to businesses some of whom have stated they would hold on to investment decisions. They would wait until that period of negotiation of 2 years or longer was over before they decided where to perhaps build their next factory or invest in another company somewhere in Europe. That would lead to uncertainty.
Well, it would be helpful if the government didn't stir up the uncertainty by giving the G20 to write a statement encouraging that doubt. The fact is, everyone should reassure all the world markets that during the period of negotiation, first of all informal and then formal, under Article 50, everything carries on as normal.
Sure, but no one will know what's going to happen after 2 years, and no one will know what the deal is, and you could see why businesses would hold on to their money.
Yes, but it's very clear to us, on our side, that we have the whole world open to us.
We
would get
do.
our seat
We
back.
already have the
No, we
whole
don't.
world.
We are
Of course we do.
We do not. For instance, on the World Trade Organization, we have a 28th of a seat, represented by a Swedish psychiatric nurse who is probably a very, very intelligent person, but not my first choice to represent the UK.
And we have greater weight and clout with 500 million consumers as part of the biggest market in the world.
But if you take trade, tiny countries, like Iceland or New Zealand, who've got direct trade deals with China, we would open up the whole world. The opportunities for us are enormous. And where Emma also must not let slip is that the EU is effectively leaving us. They are going to form this new entity around the Eurozone. So the idea that it's a nice, stable, cosy club is not true. We're going to be left on the outside of this new entity with some ill-defined associate status.
That's rubbish.
It's been 5 presidents'
Well, hang on,
report.
why is that rubbish?
Because we're one of 9 member states who do not have the euro. We're not the only country not to have the euro. We're one of 9 member states not to have the euro. And we're an integral part of the single market. Again, pessimism from the Eurosceptics about what we can do whilst remaining in the EU, working with our partners.
But why would EU leaders have an interest in making life more difficult for the UK? I mean, surely they just would get on with that negotiating period, set up new trade agreements with the UK, and it could be liberating in the way that Ian Duncan Smith has described it. It could be, to coin his phrase, a stride into the light, not a leap into the dark.
Because I think we are more prosperous and we are stronger by staying
but you
in
don't
the
know
EU,
that because we've
working together
how do you
and
know?
negotiating more ambitious trade deals with big economies around the world. The US government has suggested that they're not that interested in doing a bilateral trade deal with us because they're more interested in doing a trade deal with the biggest single market in the world, namely the EU of some 500 million people. So we have more clout and more power in the world by being a member of the EU than we would be if we were on the outside.
Right. Isn't it true that both sides are scaremongering? I mean, isn't it true that both the Leave and Remain camps are setting out to people their sort of doom and disaster scenarios if we either stay or leave? So that this idea that negative campaigning is only on one side just isn't the case.
Well, I think we're actually being cold and realistic. Contrary to what Emma said, the 5 Presidents' report says they are going to form this new entity around the Eurozone. We will be excluded, and what Mervyn King has said this weekend, which says we are extremely wise to be well away from the Eurozone. So, we're on the outside, something called associate status, it's not clear. If we actually let them get on with the whole political and judicial arrangements, get out of all that, and have a totally new arrangement based on trade and cooperation, the world is right open to us. We would re-galvanise world free trade with the Anglosphere. I was in Washington. Contrary to what Emma said, there are large numbers of people in America who would very much like to deal with on sectors like automobiles and drugs and issues like that.
This is a false choice.
Right. Well, let Emma respond and we'll come on to security.
It's still the case that we trade more with the rest of the EU than we do any single country around the world.
But it's a diminishing amount, isn't it, of trade?
But let me just say this. This is a false choice that the Eurosceptics like to bandy about, that somehow we have to choose between trading with the rest of the EU or the rest of the world. That's absolutely rubbish. We have the best of both worlds at the moment. We trade very closely with our European partners. 47% of our trade goes with them, and the rest of our trade is with the rest of the world. And we do very well, thank you very much.
So it sounds like you don't even want to reform the EU. As it says, you're very happy with all the controls that come from...
To be perfectly frank, even though he's your party leader, I thought that the Prime Minister did a decent job in his renegotiation, because he clarified some of the issues around the Eurozone's relationship with the non-Eurozone. And I stress again, we're not the only country in the EU not to have the euro. And so he did clarify those arrangements, and he clarified some things to do with immigration as well, which I thought was very helpful.
Do you think, he'll be very pleased to have your support, I'm sure, Emma.
I'm sure.
Do you think that Eurosceptic ministers should have access to civil service papers?
I think that there is, again, a huge problem with the government taking a position, which I agree with, which is that we should remain as part of a reformed EU, but at the same time suspending collective responsibility. And there also is a huge problem with David Cameron rolling over again and again and again just to please the Eurosceptics. And that's why we're here.
Isn't
right
that the
now.
problem? I mean, Owen Paterson, in some ways you've got your way by having collective responsibility abandoned, but now you want to have access to the papers that are supposedly only the ones that actually refer to the EU referendum directly. You can't have your cake and eat it.
Let me just very quickly pick up Emma's first comments. I see 10 years of opportunity here. The EU is lousy at negotiating trade deals. They're still faffing around with America. India's in the pipeline. China's in the pipeline. How can it be that tiny countries like Iceland and New Zealand can do a direct deals with China? I see this as a wonderful opportunity to open up the whole world, to work with the Anglosphere, to work with the Commonwealth. We got wonderful relations in Southeast Asia, and we would actually re-galvanise world free trade. Part of the reason people are drowning as we speak in the Mediterranean, partly is because of the complete breakdown in free trade. And that is because
how do you make that
blocks like the EU are rotten at organising these trade deals.
All right.
So
on the papers.
Well, it's an absolute nonsense, this. And this is a complete breach of the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, which is endorsed by well-known democracies like Russia, where the government is supposed to be neutral in constitutional referendums.
Right.
It's absolutely clear about
it. But you know the government has taken it. You know the government has taken a position.
We had all this with Purda, and it is quite wrong that a senior civil servant should be telling ministers who take a different line on the European issue that they do not have access to papers. Someone like George Eustace must have the same access to all the papers in DEFRA, my old department, because he and my successor Liz Truss have completely differing views. Now, pretty well, the majority of DEFRA's activity has been handed to the European institutions as a competence: agriculture, food, drink, environment. It is absolutely vital that George does have access to up-to-date data and to the latest developments.
What are you going to do if that continues, that he can't get access to those papers?
Well, I personally raised it with the Prime Minister in questions on Wednesday, and I can assure you there are many other members of Parliament on all sides who are exercised by this, because my worry about this, if it's seen that the government is trying to cheat, people will not regard the referendum as legitimate, and that's a real danger. It must be seen to be fought fairly from the beginning.
We see this over again and again and again. We've seen this before. The Eurosceptics moan and bang on about process because they are trying... This is an insurance claim for them. If they lose the referendum in June, they will claim that it's not fair so that they can have a never-endum, another referendum. And if they lose that one, they'll also claim that one's not fair so they can have another referendum.
Is that what you'll do, Owen Paterson?
And it is just such a predictable pattern. I'm sorry.
No, I think...
It's all about process and none of the big... Why don't we talk about the big arguments? I mean, that's what people are really worried about.
Would you call for another referendum? Would it settle it? If the result is that Britain stays, votes to remain, would you settle it briefly?
We did win the argument on Purda. I mean, the government wanted to overrule your government's rules on Purda, which some of us in opposition accepted, actually the opposition party accepted, as the minimum, 4 weeks. And the government did back off on that, and I think they were correct to do so. They listened, and I hope they will listen to this issue on giving fair access to ministers.
I hope to get on to the big argument.
It is vital that the public see this to be a fair battle.
You're on for the whole show.